everyone. I'm Martin, and I'm going to show you bits and pieces from my PhD research supported by Red Hat, and I'm going to talk about usable security. Now, what I mean about the usable security? Let's start with an anti-question. What I mean by unusable security? Something like this. You might have seen an unusable error message like this yourself. If you haven't, feel free to ask your relatives, daughters and mothers, and they will definitely describe to you something like this. And if you think that this is only an issue towards the grannies, nannies, daughters, and the non-IT people, then I'm here to tell you that developers may have a problem with this too. With an example, you probably know curl, a library that helps you download files over the internet, ideally doing it securely using OpenSSL, verifying certificates, all sorts of stuff. When you want to set up curl to use SSL and secure file transfer, you use two directives. They are called curl SSL verify peer and curl SSL verify host. Now, for some reason that I can't really understand, prior to April 2012, PayPal developers decided to set these both to false. Now, this is not about API unusability, this is about developer stupidity. But anyway, they were reported that this is the case, and they corrected the case and set both of these to true. However, while curl SSL verify peer is a boolean setting whether you should or should not check the certificate, curl SSL verify host is an integer, which 0 sets no hostname checking, 1 is a debug mode, and 2 means that you're actually checking the hostname. So setting both to true defaults to 1, basically effectively disabling hostname checking at all, and so ending in the same place as with setting both to false. And this now is not a problem of the developer that much. I claim this is the problem of the developer of the API, because this API is not usable. You would just expect both of the settings to be the same way because they look the same. They are kind of intuitive the same way. And even if you check the documentation for the first one, you would see, okay, it's the intuitive way that I thought it would be. It's a boolean, just set it to true. The other one just isn't. Now, what we did last year, we decided to check for usability, and we concentrated on OpenSSL because there are, stories about OpenSSL and its usability. A first question of the talk. Who of you have used OpenSSL in the last year? Please raise your hands. Quite a lot, I'd say like 2/3 of the whole. We set up a research booth here at DevConf. You might have participated, and actually I probably want to know who of you has participated in the last year's research? Hands up again. 3 only, okay. What was the point of the booth? We took the attendees, the developers, the administrators, people here, and asked them to interact with OpenSSL. And they had emotions. For example, saying that we all know OpenSSL sucks, but finally there's someone collecting empirical evidence. People actually liking the research that we did. On the other hand, there were people completely satisfied, claiming that OpenSSL is intuitive and totally well documented, and they wouldn't change a thing. I can't really say that both of these opinions were half and half. I would say there were more people of the first one. But if you have used OpenSSL yourself, which most of you have done, you probably have some emotions and opinions of yourself. What we did, we had about 90 participants, and we asked them to do 2 things with command line OpenSSL: to issue a self-signed certificate and to validate 4 certificates that they were given, with some constraints of trusting the default authorities installed in the system and the particular DevConf CA authority that they were given by us. What did we learn? For the first task, issuing the certificates, 45% of the attendees succeeded in issuing the certificates for the user that we asked them to do. However, 87% thought that they succeeded. So there's a great mismatch in between what people think and what is really true of their works and of their creations. Mostly they just created a certificate signing request instead of a certificate, or just generated a key and thought that was sufficient. Or when we asked them to create a certificate for some particular user, they created a certificate, but the user nor his or her name or anything of it was mentioned anywhere in the certificate, usually going with the placeholder names that are standard or with something like name, and stuff like that. 85% of the developers decided to create the certificate explicitly setting the key size. Because most of the tutorials, the examples in the manual page and online, use an explicit setting of the key size. This is not that much necessary because there's a default, and the default is kind of reasonable. It's 2 kilo key. But none of the tutorials use the default key. When we look into the key sizes that they created, it was kind of expectable. 38% 4 kilo key, then nearly a half 2 kilo key, and 20% creating a single kilo key. God bless us, no one created keys shorter than 1 kilo. When we look into the tutorials, documentation, and examples that the developers use, we see roughly the same distribution of the key sizes in the tutorials, so they actually reflect the tutorials used well. There were no tutorials suggesting shorter keys than 1 kilo. Looking into the subject fields of the created certificates, 42% created a certificate with an organization field of Internet Widgets Pty Limited, which is a nonsensical value that is set by default. Now, the interface looks in a way that it asks you, like, what do you want for a common name? What do you want for an organization? And it's always organization, colon, then in a square brackets, it's written Internet Widgets Pty Limited, and then there's a text field in which we're supposed to write. Now, everyone interpreted that this is like a nice example of what an organization field could look like the Internet Widgets Pty Limited, but only rarely people realize that if they just press enter and input nothing, this is actually the default value that will be saved in the certificate. Now, if you wanted to have the particular field empty, you should have inputted in a dot, which is, I was told, a standard behavior, but quite some of the developers didn't know that, and sometimes they even created the certificate, then inspected it, like checking what they created, and some of them were actually pretty surprised finding things like this in the certificate unintended. A quarter of the people created a certificate of version 1, which is kind of deprecated today for quite some years, and it means that it lacks extension completely, while the default created in the other options, version 3 certificates already has the extension of this certificate is not belonging to a certificate authority and some other preliminary stuff of the sort that is kind of standard today. Now, the problem was that if you created the certificate in different ways, different defaults applied. If you created the certificate directly, it was a version 3 certificate. If you decided to create a certificate signing request first and then have the request signed by another command, you issued a version 1 certificate. Why? Just because. Other things that we observed. For the second task, here are 4 certificates, and you are to validate these 4 certificates against a given CA and against the CAs trusted in the system. They were basically 1 valid, 1 expired, 1 faked, and 1 let's encrypt. Only 50% looked into the certificates, like actually displayed the base, de-armored or de-based 64th the certificate and looking into the fields. All the other ones just like did the verification command and were completely satisfied with it. And only 20 people managed to correctly identify or find out the validity of all 4 of those. Usually the Let's Encrypt one was rather problematic because no one could really tell whether OpenSSL by default checks against the system pre-installed roots or it doesn't, and the documentation doesn't really say to you, and on different systems it does different things. It's kind of complicated. People disliked OpenSSL. I mean, when I asked on particular personal opinions or emotions, they really hate OpenSSL. I'm sorry to say so. I mean, OpenSSL does an awful lot of things, and it does them quite reasonably. And considering how complex the tool is, it can't really be a nice garden with everything written on every signpost. But they really disliked it. When asking for the usability in a standardized measure, a thing called the system usability scale, the results were, unsurprisingly, rather below average. The most often expressed opinion was telling that OpenSSL is too complex. 18 people of the 70 that got into the second task. The emotions were complex, as I said. There was a person that even refused to join into the research because he said, like, so you want me to interact with OpenSSL like voluntarily? Sorry, not even for research. Then we were further interested in what resources people used to find out what to do when they couldn't do it by heart, because only very rarely people could. The gray part, all of the gray part is people using online sources, mostly Googling. The striped part is using manual page, and the white part is people just using nothing or just the tab completion for the command line for the OpenSSL tool. You see that mostly people use both online and manual pages. Often the case was predictably Googling for the first steps and then finding something, cross-checking with the manual or fine-tuning the arguments in the manual and then trying. Though there was quite a lot of people only Googling, and often they were just copy-pasting what they found. Yeah?
What are the people that use actually the dash help?
I count these into the very white part, not using the manual. I mean, the striped part is the manual page like man OpenSSL or other stuff. This correlated with previous IT experience, so the people that were the most experienced, the oldest in the field, or developed OpenSSL themselves, because yes, there were developers of OpenSSL taking part, basically did it from the top of their head. As for the online sources, 3/4 of the people ended up on Stack Exchange. Use mostly Stack Overflow, but sometimes SuperUser and the other servers of the family. So it's actually really a used resource even in between the developers, not just the students at high schools and universities. People use it. But that was kind of expectable. For the unexpectable thing, 40% of the people use the University of Wisconsin-Madison knowledge-based web pages. Why so? Because the second task was do verify these certificates, taking into account this particular local certificate authority. And there exists a page in the knowledge base that explains you how to do precisely this one thing, and there's nothing else written on the page. So the optimizations for the Google results rank it really, really high, and everyone ended up there and used it. Which means that theoretically, if you were to mess up with what people do with certificates, you could create a website that is really, really well optimized and have people basically copy-paste stuff that you provide on the website and disrupt the certificates in the world. Or, on the other hand, if you wanted to improve what people do with the certificates, maybe actually creating a website that is really, really, really nicely done may help, because people do end up on the web pages that do explain it like precisely and do concentrate on single things. Other things regarding the online sources. Only 1/4 of the web pages described any security implications of the commands that they offered you whatsoever. By security implications, meaning what should the key length be, what it means if it's too short, what it means if the validity of the certificate is like 10 years, why is it bad, or why is it good, or why is it okay. And about the same number of web pages explain the parameters of the commands that they offered. Again, you usually end up on a page or a Stack Overflow thread telling you use this OpenSSL command, and very rarely there's someone explaining, and this argument stands for this argument stands for that, and this is why you should go -C and not -D because it's different. As I mentioned earlier, mostly people just copy-pasted this code without doing anything with it. There were 8 people altogether, which is 9%, that did any change or modification to the copy-pasted code snippet whatsoever, usually messing up with the validity period or with the key size. And actually half of them going for longer key sizes and longer validity periods, and the other half, roughly, for shorter validity periods and for shorter keys, not necessarily adjusting both. So people really took the stuff from the internet, not necessarily cross-checking it in the manual, and just used it. So again, if you were to either disrupt or improve what people do, then actually improving the documentation or the answers on Stack Overflow will help. And people sometimes told us that they were evaluating the quality of the Stack Overflow answers based on their rating on the site, but the rating did not necessarily correspond to the security rating of the answer, because that's the rating of the community. Another little quiz. Imagine an online tutorial or Stack Overflow or a page of the sort asks you to do a command like this. What manual page would you call for this command? And now I give you options. Man OpenSSL space verify, dot verify, dash verify, or man verify. Think a bit. Now, who goes for number 1? Please, hands up. Okay, about 5. Who goes for number 2? About 6. Number 3? 1. Number 4? About 8. Number 5? About 10. And I mean, this is a security track at DevConf. The thing is, number 5 is correct. Everyone eventually got to the number 5, often with help with Google and online tutorials. People, about a quarter of them tried going man OpenSSL verify, which opens both of the manual pages in succession, which means it opens the first one, and when you try to close it, there's a rather unfamiliar looking message that says there's a next manual page to display. Do you want to display it or exit the manual page viewer? Which usually got confused. The people got confused and closed it, so they didn't get to the other one. As for the dot or dash versions, the thing is, they don't work in the environment they were given. It was a Ubuntu machine. Though it's not unified, because I think that the dash version is the preferred and maybe even the only way that works on Mac OS. And the dot version is something that works on Gen 2, or used to. Not sure whether it still does now. As for the man OpenSSL, the main manual page, it looks like this. And you can clearly see, or actually not see, that it would be written somewhere at the top that the manual pages are split into individual subcommands, and you should actually call the individual subcommands as the man pages. True, if you know your way around. Then if you scroll all the way down in the See Also section, you can see that the manual pages exist, and you probably can find your way around. But if you are that sort of person, you're most likely not looking into this page to find the arguments of OpenSSL verify. And there were people looking it in here because there were people like, OpenSSL documentation is so bad, it's supposed to have the command line of -ca file, and when I open the manual page and go search with the backslash and type in ca file, it's not there. So the documentation is not complete. Not realizing at all that this is a wrong manual page. Another thing that people complained about in the manual page was that it lacked examples. That's not true, to be fair to OpenSSL and its manual page. The examples are there, and actually, for at least one, but maybe in both of the tasks, the solution nearly to the precise problem is there in the examples section. The only thing is, again, returning to the manual page structure, the example section is after synopsis, description, comment, summary, details, I don't know, then examples, and then possibly see also. And since people didn't realize that the structure was like this, they didn't look into the examples, and they thought they aren't there. Because the manual page itself is like about 13 screens, so not something you would like to read in the whole. Now, I'm not going to suggest to change up the manual pages and put the examples up above, because the standard way is the nice way, because when you know the standard, you know where to search for things, and you can like do things easily in different fields. But it seemed that most of the DevConf participants, can't really tell whether they were Linux hardcore guys or not, were unaware of the standard structure, not looking for the see also section to see the other related manual pages, nor for the examples that are buried quite deep. So, what to do? One thing that we thought of, we started to think small, because small things can be achieved earlier. One thing to think of was creating alternative manual pages. Thinking of git commit. If you go man git commit, it does not open two manual pages, at least on Fedora and I think Ubuntu. It symlinks to man git dash commit and opens what you would be expecting. And the question, yeah?
If you call man space OpenSSL space verify,
Yeah.
first opens OpenSSL man page, then it opens the right man page OpenSSL verify because it expands to commands.
It expands to two commands. Not sure about Fedora. In Ubuntu last year, there was a message in between the manual pages, and when the person didn't find it on the first one, he was kind of confused that the second one was up and usually closed it. Because I'm not sure about you, but I'm not usually opening more than a single manual page at a time.
Actually, OpenSSL space verify works in Fedora now.
OpenSSL space verify is probably working in Fedora now. We actually did this. We discussed this with the OpenSSL developers, and they created alternative names for OpenSSL dash verify and dash all the subcommands, and that it was the matter of Fedora maintainers and porters. Maybe the person is even in the room, not sure. Just to do the symlinks of this. So. Another small thing that we thought of was help commands and dash help arguments, because when you found out that OpenSSL has subcommands like OpenSSL verify without the first dashes, you would expect that OpenSSL help would display the list of the subcommands or the general stuff. It didn't. And again, when you learn that you could expect that for the subcommands OpenSSL verify dash help, it would display help or dash H. It didn't. All this was resolved in 1.10 because we used OpenSSL 1.02, I think, last year, which was not particularly new. So this is done already by the developers. Now, you may be thinking whether I actually mean dash help in this place and not dash dash help or dash H. I actually mean this because in OpenSSL, the arguments are either dash and the letter or dash and the full word. They do not have the dash dash convention for the whole word options. That is also something that people kind of disliked because they saw, okay, it should be CA file, so they went dash dash CA, wanted tab completion, and it gave them nothing because they had double dash there. This is still a thing. This is not something that could be resolved easily because people using OpenSSL are used to it. And unfortunately, compatibility preservation is a thing that really shouldn't be underestimated. Though there could probably be a possibility of supporting both, but still OpenSSL arguments already have like a tons of options, and now it would be 2 tons of options. So not sure there's a solution like readily available to that. There was one more thing regarding the online sources. We noticed that about quarter or probably less of the manual pages online on the very OpenSSL web pages changed URLs at some point, I think 2016, and often the well-written Stack Overflow answers and thread and the tutorials tried to link to the official documentation, like use this command, it does this and this, see the official documentation linking to OpenSSL, but the link didn't work anymore because the names changed and the URL translation wasn't done correctly. This was a small fix, already done, discussed with the developers, and it should work now. So hopefully we corrected quite a lot of Stack Overflow answers linking now to the official documentation again. Further interface changes could be thought of. For example, when you're going interactively issuing the certificate, when you come to the subject field, it asks you on all sorts of things, like the usual stuff, the common name, the organization unit, the locality, which is something not that much used today, at least in contrast to the subject alternative names that are heavily used to identify mostly host names, but also emails, much less IPs, though that is also a possibility. And it just didn't ask you for a subject alternative name, so people didn't use it. At least in the interactive process. In contrast, GNU-TLS, in the default interactive way, asks you at some point, is this certificate supposed to belong to a TLS server? Because that is quite expected use case. And if you say yes, then it skips asking you for organization unit and stuff like that, and directly asks you for a domain and sets that domain both to the CN and to the subject alternative name extension. It would be nice if the OpenSSL asked for the domain as well. Actually, setting a subject alternative name, issuing a certificate in OpenSSL command line was pretty complicated, because the only way to do that was to use a configuration file and set the domain there, and then tell it, issue a certificate based on things in this configuration file. But configuration file was even a bit more complicated than the arguments, at least according to the developers and their opinions last year. This again changed. Just today in the morning I was told by someone at the conference that in the current developer branch the command line argument for the subject alternative name is already there, and so it should be nice. As I mentioned, the defaults, apart from the version 1 versus version 3 certificate created by different routes of creating a certificate. One more inconsistent default was the key size, because as I said, the default key size is there and it's kind of nice, the 2 kilos. But again, it depends what way you are taking, because if you are using, I think, first generating a key and then generating a signing request and then a certificate, then at some point the default key size is 1 kilo. And still generating a key can be done with the newer option and the older option, and one of them is consistent with the 2 kilo and the other one is inconsistent with the single kilo. So getting all these things tidied up might be nice, because then we would know what the default actually is. The man pages, as I mentioned, other improvements such as writing into the first manual page that it's split in between the modules and individual man pages exists. These things were not done, at least by myself yet. Maybe they will be in the future, don't really know. Another thing, people complained about the error messages, because when you created a key and you were asked for a passphrase to protect the key, and you wanted not to protect it with the passphrase, you got an error message with about 4 lines, where somewhere in there was a thing saying that it should be from 1 to 1024 characters, and there were line numbers and function numbers in the meantime, and people got confused often, and they would have succeeded in the task otherwise would they understood this particular error message with the 0 passphrase. As for the error messages themselves, more research is in the works. Currently, we have a research booth about 10 meters that way by air, where we're looking into how developers, administrators, well, the DevConf attendees, understand error messages that they get. Again, we're in the niche of certificate validation, so if you know at least a bit of what the certificate is, which I guess all of you do, and have about half an hour time and want to get the Red Hat branded cap or a backpack or a notebook, stop by and we will be happy to include you into the research. What to take away from all of this? Basically, that usability matters, even for skilled users like yourselves, not only for the grannies, nannies, and daughters regarding the error messages as you saw on the second slide. One more thing, if you want to take something physical, the research go to the RSA conference presented April this year in San Francisco, and I have a preprint that I can freely handle, or you can find it online if you want. So that is also a possibility what to take away. And even a bit sooner than I expected, that concludes the talk. Any questions are welcome, and I'd be happy to see you at the booth. It was supposed to be 40 minutes talk, so I'm 10 minutes sooner. I apologize for that. It went a bit quicker than I expected. But feel free to ask, and hopefully there will be details of the research that I can think of. As for the validity period, I mentioned for the keys that everyone went with the explicit size, or not everyone, but 85%, the majority. The same case was with the validity period. The default is, I think, quite nice 30 days, and about 80 to 90% of the people went with explicitly setting the number of days, usually going with about 1 year, though less with 2 years, though there were extremes creating a certificate for 10 years, or for 9999999, which is overflow, so basically defaulting to about 10 years. There was 2 people from the whole research, I think, that decreased the 30-day validity period to 10 days because the task was set that this is a testing certificate. You are testing a particular feature of the software that allows you to upload the certificate, and you need to test this particular feature. So that's why you're creating a certificate, and 10 days validity would be perfectly okay. That was one more thing that I know that I dropped from the presentation because I thought it would be quite long. Open the questions. Yes?
What percentage of people who consider themselves experts didn't complete one of the tasks?
I wanted to find it out, though it's very complicated to find out who is an expert and who is not an expert.
It wasn't who was an expert, who thought they were an expert. Because that was one of the questions in there.
There were questions, what experience you have with OpenSSL and with certificates. I think it correlated, but not much. And I couldn't really separate the people into the discrete groups of experts and non-experts. So unfortunately, I can't really answer that. Yeah?
First of all, like a small comment, if I can, like, please
Sure.
use women, girlfriends, mothers as your default example of non-technical users.
Point taken, thanks.
Second point, just one question. Did you look at all at sort of programmatic usage of OpenSSL or just the CLI? Because I have some experience in this area and it's not great of how apps use OpenSSL and get horribly wrong.
I second that. It's not pretty.
Or was that out of scope for you?
It was out of scope last year. We focused on the CLI because it was much easier to test, and because at the conference you can't really have people sitting for an hour and programming something, and doing programmatic OpenSSL would take a rather heterogeneous amount of time for different people. So not at the conference. In the meantime, we had a homework for university students, basically in the idea of programmatic API. We asked them to write a small program basically connecting to 100 different domains, each domain having a certificate with some particular error, and to do the validation themselves. It's not really done yet, though mostly the people were kind of able to do that, Googling, because there was nice solutions available, and it's basically one of the majority of the source codes created by the students are from 3 categories, which can be quite clearly mapped to the online sources that they used. As for this year's experiment, we are kind of a bit more in the programmatic API, as it's the error messages from the programmatic API, not from the command line. Though again, we are not having users use programmatic API themselves because it would take too much time. Yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are you planning on doing similar checks for other toolkits like UTLS and NSS?
When piloting the last year's DevConf experiment, we did a very similar experiment on university students at Masaryk University, but for all 3 of the tools, OpenSSL, GNU-TLS, and NSS. As for the both success and student experience, OpenSSL fared the best, GNU-TLS fared the second, and NSS fared the third. almost unanimously in between the students. Though it was a bit unfair against OpenSSL because that was used in one of the previous courses that some of the students already took part in, while for the GNU-TLS and NSS, except for about 2 students, no one has seen the tool before. So the comparison between GNU-TLS and NSS is somewhat more fair, but the students claim to like OpenSSL the most. The thing with NSS was that it uses a completely different approach, like ideologically. Because in GNU-TLS, like the cert tool and the command line OpenSSL, you're working with certificates as files. While in NSS, it works with the concept of a database or a certificate store. And so you have to start by creating a database certificate store, and then creating validating certificates always refers to the particular store and the identifier within the database. So that was rather counterintuitive to the students and often caused them not to be able to finish the tasks in, let's say, an hour or so. And regarding the standardized measure of usability, the system usability scale, it's also went the same way as the opinions, OpenSSL the best, GNU-TLS the second, cert tool mostly because it was command line, and NSS the third. And we didn't check any other tools than these 3.
Those were the ones I did.
Yeah.
I was particularly interested in NSS. My gut feeling was that it would not fare as well.
Though it was only the command line tool, we didn't compare the programmatic APIs, which may be completely different. Yeah. Yeah.
So how are you measuring the users? Just give the PM and with the command line history or the
I didn't really hear the question.
how are you measuring the users? You just gave them PMs and then with the command line history or the history, just how you get the data from the
Technically, we have a virtual machine for the user that's kind of recording everything that we could think of. Mostly looking into the command line history, that is rather helpful. And we also have the recordings of the screen, mostly to cross-checks when the command history is somewhat weird or we aren't sure. And the video recordings are also quite good for finding out what is the relationship between the online sources and the manual pages and the commands that the user used. Because often you can see, okay, this command is kind of weird, but you can see he found it on this particular tutorial or that one or that one. And then there's the browsing history, the timings, and the interview at the end. It's basically a very similar setup to this year's. Yeah. There was one more thing, if the question can wait, that I know that I presented elsewhere but thought it wouldn't fit into the presentation. As for the super user usage, because the people were using a Vagrant machine automatically built, and they were told that they have super user privileges if they decided that they are sudo on the account. Because the second task was validating the certificate. And we were kind of curious whether there would be people trying to take the local authority that they were told that they are trusted and copying it into the system-wide trust store somewhere in /etc. And another story comes where this trust store is, because it wasn't a Fedora machine, it was a Ubuntu machine. And so there were people like checking 3 different places till they found it. Not many people tried to do this, or even if they tried, often they were unable to find the right folder where to put it and the right command to update the store. But altogether, I think 9 users invoked sudo altogether. 2 of them installed some utilities that they wanted for bash. 3 of them basically used it for reasonable cases, like looking into the system-wide folders to see whether the Let's Encrypt authority was there or not. And 3 of them, I think, used it in a way that the tutorial told them Because one of the tutorials was, you're probably generating a certificate for Apache, which means you should go sudo OpenSSL x509 generate, and then output it into the directory of etc Apache certificates, which would require sudo, and the user wanted a different directory, so changed it, but leave sudo there. Another two users were the case of, okay, let's just go sudo switch user for root and do everything. Unfortunately, there was a single tutorial that actually told them to do this. Like, you should switch to the super user first, and only then generate certificates, validate the signatures, and then it was reasonable because at the end, they should have copied the certificates according to the tutorial somewhere to the Apache configuration, and you would have used sudo for that, but the tutorial just decided to do everything as super user because why not? Fortunately, only two tutorials that we found were using sudo in an unreliable way of the sort that I described. So the internet-wide, it's kind of good. Question?
It looks like your research is quite useful. Do you plan to continue it for another year, or is your PhD end planned?
For the moment, I do plan to continue. I'm doing a new booth just right there. You already participated. And I'm now finishing my second year of my PhD. The research is, it's an industry cooperation in between Red Hat and the university. So I'm even from time to time talking from people to people from Red Hat, what they think about this or that. So it actually seems perspective that it will continue. And I'm glad to hear that people think that it's useful. Any more questions? Yes?
Have you been somehow dealing with the problem of results affected by the people awareness involved in that? I mean, you just wanted them to generate a certificate, but the certificate or keys haven't been used anywhere. So people just funds are running. I can generate some certificate obviously and probably finish. But maybe they wouldn't do it that way when they would be securing their own infrastructure.
That is definitely one of the limitations of the study, and several participants last year also noted this to us that the task is so. Last year's was our first computer study with humans here at DevConf, so we've learned a lot from them. The thing is that these things are always set in a scenario. Last year it was, imagine you are at work, you are a software tester, and you're testing a particular piece of software that allows you to upload a public key certificate to identify yourself. You don't have a certificate, and so you asked your peer what to do. And the peer told you should use command line OpenSSL to generate the certificate for user Alice, and then try the certificate in the system to see whether it works for the user Alice. And you can do any Googling or researching, do whatever you would do in your real work. Just don't talk to colleagues because your peer told you to work alone or something of the sort. The task was kind of artificial last year. Several people were asking about an awful lot of details that weren't provided, and we actually considered that to be a way to measure whether the user is expert enough or not, because if he or she had an awful lot of detailed questions like what is the purpose, what should be the validity, what should be this, and is it ever going to be a TLS certificate, that probably meant that the user was expert enough. But unfortunately, we only thought of this post-experiment, so we didn't have that as a checkbox like user asked a lot of questions. This year we tried to, over the time, we tried to improve the precision of the settings and make them as plausible as possible, so to speak. And so even choosing the errors that we are testing today, we prefer the errors that you can actually get in the real world and not going for some obscurity that no developer ever finds because it rarely happens and is nearly never used on the internet. And we can't really blame OpenSSL for having a bad error message for this obscure case. Does it answer the question? Yeah. Anything else?
So maybe like if you are thinking about more realistic scenarios, I think generating a certificate signing request, then getting it to some virtual CA, like a web page, and then getting the certificate back and verifying that the certificate
that would have been a much realistic scenario than the last year's, because the processes in the companies, in universities are often create a certificate signing request, paste it in this online form, and then we will email you the certificate, and that is what people need to do. Rarely you actually will be signing the certificate yourself, unless you really want a self-signed certificate for some reason. Unfortunately, we learned that only too late. Yeah? Again, didn't understand the question.
Did you try to make some web page with manual on the internet?
Like making a nice optimized web page explaining something? Not yet. Though I would say that creating such a page would not be that little work as it may seem. As probably people who write documentation in this room have an idea about. And people who read it, yeah. One participant last year, when he was asked to assess the quality and usability of the OpenSSL manual page, said that the people writing the manual pages have and see very different use cases than the people that are reading the manual pages, and they expect different things in the page. Which was a nice thought, because I'm not sure the developer of the main page realized that the thing that the manual pages for the individual subcommands are split, it can be rather counterintuitive, and finding it in the C also pages may not be as easy as he thought. That's why testing with all the developers of DevConf might be useful. Anything else? Yeah, we changed that a bit, and we are having more of a discussion this year also when asking what the person got, what he understood, and if he got something wrong, there's usually the pedagogical part of us explaining the situation and getting the user opinions on the right track. So we got that from multiple users. Even when I emailed, I guess many of you, about last week that the results are in and then the paper can be downloaded online. Several people, 3 or so, emailed me back like, can you tell me whether I did correctly or I failed as well? And I was like, sorry, the data was anonymized at the collection, so I have no idea to know which one is yours, and I can't really tell you whether you succeeded or not. If there are no other questions.
There's no question, we can finish.
Okay.
And people do not forget about the surprise meeting outside.
Surprise meeting outside. Research booth at DevConf. 2 more days if you want to stop by and get some Red Hat merch. Thanks for coming, and sorry again for the shorter time. I hope we had a nice enough discussion instead of it.
Something like this for free.
Or others. Enjoy your extra tea break and see you someday. In case you might be interested in the article preprint, stop by.
I'm interested in the NSS one is I'm an NSS developer.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So I'm not surprised that the task to create certificates would be difficult, because that wasn't what the tool is for. It can do it because we use it for tests, but the tools to manage the database.
Yeah.
Which is why it's focused on the database, but it's still a good feedback.
But for the users seeing NSS, at least the tool or the library itself for the first time, the main manual page lacked a section explaining it's all about the database. Think in the database terms, create the database, and then think of the database. Yeah. That was what it lacked, and that was what the people needed to find somewhere online, and they either did or got comments that they didn't understand because there was a database.
Yeah, like, okay, you have to do three sets of commands before you get to where you want to do.
Yeah,
right?
basically.
Create it and initialize it. Yeah, and we've actually changed some of this stuff because we were creating databases without a password.
Yeah.
And you have to initialize the database to do anything with it.
Yeah.
And
stupid defaults are a big problem with all of the crypto stuff. Like your example of what company was it? I forgot.
Internet, which is PTY Limited.
No, the one about the default verify being no.
The PayPal.
And you know, Python up until 2.7 had defaulted to not verifying any SSL certificates.
Yeah, well,
it just trusted anything.
It's not that rare. I mean, the curl thing that I mentioned wasn't just the PayPal thing. It was like Zencard, Apache even. It was like 20 libraries widely used.
Because everybody when they're testing and developing, they just want to see does the bits work.
The code path work.
And
without making all verification.
Making an actual certificate that works.
And still the defaults are not really a silver bullet because for curl, the default is to verify everything and true. But if you set it to true manually, you basically disable the safe default.
Stupid. I just wondered, did you come across this during your research at all?
Note about trusted certificates towards platforms. Yes, probably so.
I wrote that.
Okay.
I get quite a lot of feedback on it, so I just wondered if you'd seen
That's the page explaining which etc is something
where
you should check.
all of it.
I found that about 2 months ago, and I was like, wow, this is the single only article on the internet explaining me where to look for it and why not.
Yeah, I think people find it quite a lot because
it was very, very nice.
Thank you for the research. It's really good that someone's doing this. Like everyone said, like putting numbers on how bad the problem is.
Just like the quote said, everyone knows it sucks. Finally, there's someone collecting empirical evidence.
Yeah, it's really, really bad.
Thanks.